11 black female singers who destroyed their voices by smoking too much. What if the voices that once seemed powerful enough to last forever were being quietly changed by a habit hiding in plain sight? Whitney Houston, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, Mary Wells, and other legendary black women created songs that defined generations, but cigarettes became part of a much larger struggle that in several cases affected their breathing, vocal clarity range, or ability to perform. Some recognized the warning signs and quit. Others faced devastating health consequences, while a few managed remarkable comebacks. But how much damage was truly caused by smoking, and how much came from age, illness, addiction, and decades on stage? Stay with us as we uncover 11 unforgettable stories. Subscribe to Remembered Lives channel and comment which singer's transformation shocked you most. Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston once possessed a voice so effortless that impossible notes seemed almost ordinary. At her peak, songs like I Have Nothing, Greatest Love of All, and I Will Always Love You showcased extraordinary control, sustained power, and a soaring upper register. But by the time of her 2010 Nothing But Love World Tour, audiences could hear a striking difference. The bright, commanding soprano of the 1980s and 1990s had become darker, heavier, and noticeably less consistent. Cigarette smoking was one documented factor. Houston continued smoking during her attempted comeback, and reports from the 2010 tour indicated that she had not successfully stopped. Her longtime mentor Clive Davis later expressed his belief that cigarettes, even more than drugs, prevented her voice from fully recovering. For any singer, prolonged smoke exposure can irritate the vocal folds and compromise respiratory efficiency, two areas especially important to a performer whose style demanded powerful belts and long sustained phrases. Still, blaming cigarettes alone would distort Houston's story. Years of substance abuse, illness, physical strain, touring, and natural aging also complicated her vocal decline. During some late performances, she struggled with passages she had once delivered effortlessly, yet flashes of the unmistakable Whitney sound remained. The transcript itself correctly warns against attributing every change exclusively to smoking. Houston died on February 11, 2012, at age 48. Her official cause of death was accidental drowning with atherosclerotic heart disease and cocaine use identified as contributing factors, not cigarette smoking. Her autopsy nevertheless documented chronic changes in her lungs associated with smoking. That distinction matters. Cigarettes did not single-handedly destroy Whitney Houston's legendary instrument. They were one element in a much larger physical struggle. What makes her story heartbreaking is hearing the contrast: a young Whitney who seemed able to make her voice do anything, and an older artist fighting increasingly hard to command the same extraordinary gift. Sarah Vaughan. Sarah Vaughan's voice was never ordinary. Emerging from the bebop revolution of the 1940s, she possessed astonishing control, precise pitch, and a range that allowed her to move from resonant lows to brilliant upper notes with remarkable ease. Recordings such as Misty Loverman and Broken Hearted Melody captured an instrument so flexible that musicians often treated her voice almost like another horn in the band. But listeners comparing those early recordings with her performances decades later can hear an unmistakable transformation. Vaughan was a long-time cigarette smoker. As the years passed, her naturally rich voice became progressively darker, heavier, and huskier. Contemporary accounts connected at least part of that increasing huskiness to smoking. By 1986, Vaughan herself estimated that her range extended roughly 2 octaves and a fifth, while her later performances revealed a deeper vocal character than the remarkable instrument heard during her younger years. Still, it would be misleading to claim cigarettes alone destroyed Sarah Vaughan's voice. Aging, decades of demanding performances, and changing vocal technique also mattered. What smoking unquestionably added was repeated stress to a respiratory and vocal system on which her career depended. Eventually, the consequences became much more serious than a change in tone. Vaughan developed lung cancer and battled the disease for approximately 7 months. Even while seriously ill, she reportedly hoped to record again and remained connected to performing almost until the end. Sarah Vaughan died on April 3, 1990, at 66. Her recordings preserve an extraordinary musical timeline, the agile brilliance of her youth and the increasingly smoky, weighty sound of her later decade. The voice changed, but the intelligence behind it never disappeared. Even when her physical instrument became darker and more weathered, Sarah Vaughan remained unmistakably the divine one. Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin did not need critics or doctors to convince her that cigarettes were affecting her voice. She could hear the difference herself. For an artist whose entire identity rested on an extraordinary instrument, that realization became powerful enough to force a major change. The Queen of Soul had built her reputation on astonishing vocal flexibility. Classics including Respect, Think, Chain of Fools, and You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman demanded everything from deep gospel-inflected tones to explosive upper register passages. At her best, Franklin could move through registers with tremendous freedom while maintaining the emotional authority that made her instantly recognizable. But after years of cigarette smoking, something began changing. In a 1999 interview, Franklin explained that one important reason she quit was that she simply did not like what she was hearing in her own voice. After giving up cigarettes, she described the improvement as dramatic, a night and day difference, particularly in her range and clarity. That makes Franklin especially important to this story, because the evidence comes directly from the singer herself. Rather than waiting until the problem became irreversible, she recognized that cigarettes were interfering with qualities essential to her career and acted. Quitting was not easy. Franklin described stopping smoking as requiring extraordinary discipline. Yet, the decision paid dividends. She continued performing challenging material for years afterward, demonstrating substantial vocal strength well into the later stages of her career. Aretha died in 2018 at age 76, but her story should not be presented as one of cigarettes completely destroying her voice. It is almost the opposite. She heard the warning signs and responded. For a woman famous for demanding respect, perhaps one of her most consequential decisions was showing respect for the extraordinary instrument that had made her the Queen of Soul. Billie Holiday. Listen to Billie Holiday in the 1930s, then listen to Lady in Satin from 1958. The difference can be startling. In her younger years, Holiday's voice was light, flexible, intimate, and beautifully controlled. By her final recordings, it had become darker, rougher, narrower, and increasingly fragile. Yet somehow the damaged edges made her performances sound almost unbearably personal. Cigarettes were part of that transformation, but they were far from the whole story. Holiday smoked while also enduring years of heavy drinking, heroin addiction, legal problems, exhausting performances, and deteriorating physical health. Historical assessments cited in the transcript indicate that her vocal decline was already evident by the early 1950s, and that drinking, smoking, and drug use exacerbated the deterioration. By the time Holiday recorded Lady in Satin, the youthful range heard on earlier classics such as God Bless the Child was largely gone. What remained, however, was something technique alone could never explain: her phrasing. Holiday could delay a word, bend a melody, or allow a fractured note to communicate pain with extraordinary emotional precision. That distinction is essential for avoiding fake news. Cigarettes did not single-handedly destroy Billie Holiday's voice. Smoking operated alongside addiction, illness, alcohol, relentless work, and an extraordinarily difficult life. Holiday died on July 17, 1959, at only 44. Her body had suffered enormous damage, and the difference between her early and late recordings remains audible more than 6 decades later. But here lies the haunting paradox. Technically, Billie had lost much of what she once possessed. Emotionally, some listeners believe she had never sounded more powerful. So was that final voice simply broken, or had Holiday learned to transform every crack and limitation into something no technically perfect singer could reproduce? Mary Wells. For Mary Wells, the consequences of years of smoking eventually became terrifyingly literal. The woman whose voice had carried one of Motown's most beloved songs could suddenly barely communicate with her own voice at all. During the early 1960s, Wells became one of Motown's first major stars. Her defining recording, My Guy, written and produced by Smokey Robinson, reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1964. Her warm, effortless delivery made her immediately recognizable, and at the height of her success, she helped establish the commercial foundation upon which Motown would build an empire. But Wells was also a heavy cigarette smoker. The transcript describes her as having smoked approximately 2 packs a day. Then in 1990, doctors discovered a cancerous tumor in her larynx. A tracheotomy and treatment left Wells unable to speak normally. She sometimes communicated by writing messages or silently mouthing words. Doctors considered a return to professional singing unlikely. For a professional vocalist, few outcomes could have been more devastating. Her crisis was compounded by financial hardship. Wells lacked adequate health insurance, prompting friends and fellow performers to help. The Rhythm and Blues Foundation organized support with artists including Diana Ross, Bruce Springsteen, Rod Stewart, and The Temptations, contributing toward her medical expenses. Despite chemotherapy, doctors discovered in 1991 that the cancer was spreading. Wells died on July 26, 1992, at just 49. Among the singers in this story, Mary Wells represents one of the clearest and most heartbreaking cases. Smoking is a major established risk factor for laryngeal cancer, and her heavy smoking history formed part of a devastating medical trajectory. The cruelest detail remains impossible to ignore. Mary Wells spent her life becoming famous through her voice, then faced her final years struggling simply to use it. Andra Day. Andra Day's story is unusual because cigarettes were not a habit she carried for decades. She deliberately started smoking while preparing to portray Billie Holiday in the 2021 film, The United States vs. Billie Holiday. Day wanted to understand Holiday's physical habits and capture the rough-weathered quality associated with her later voice. She also lost roughly 40 pounds during the transformation. What began as commitment to a role, however, eventually affected the real instrument behind Day's own career. After filming, Day revealed that doctors found hemorrhaging and inflamed blood vessels on her vocal cords. Her voice became noticeably drier and more likely to crack, while notes she had previously trusted suddenly became difficult to reach. For the singer behind the powerful anthem Rise Up, those changes were frightening. Day admitted that losing confidence in notes that once came naturally affected her psychologically, as well as physically. Importantly, Day has never blamed anyone else for that decision. She explained that nobody required her to smoke. She chose to do it because she wanted her portrayal of Holiday to feel authentic. Later, she openly questioned whether taking that risk had been worthwhile. Recovery was gradual. While preparing her 2024 album Cassandra Charaith, Day reported that her voice was finally becoming stronger again. Performances at New York's Blue Note helped rebuild her confidence as she rediscovered notes and vocal territory that had become difficult after the film. That makes Andra Day one of the clearest cases in this story. Smoking did not permanently destroy her career, but the documented damage was real. Her experience demonstrates something sobering: a singer does not necessarily need decades of cigarette exposure before the voice begins paying a price. Dionne Warwick. Few singers were better suited to Burt Bacharach and Hal David's sophisticated compositions than Dionne Warwick. Songs including Walk On By, I Say a Little Prayer, and Anyone Who Had a Heart required precision, smooth breath, control, delicate phrasing, and the ability to navigate unusual melodic lines. During the 1960s, Warwick possessed the bright, agile instrument those songs demanded. Decades later, listeners heard something considerably different. Cigarettes had accompanied Warwick since her college years. According to accounts referenced in the transcript, Bacharach disliked seeing her smoke during recording sessions, but she continued. Even at 71, Warwick was remarkably candid about the habit. In a 2012 interview with The Guardian, she described smoking as her worst habit, saying she had smoked since college and simply enjoyed it. By that stage, her vocal character had changed substantially. Reviews from 2012 and 2013 described a lower, huskier instrument with her upper register less prominent than during her classic recordings. The deeper register sometimes carried a rougher quality, although critics continued praising the musical intelligence and phrasing that had always distinguished her performances. But accuracy matters here. There is no solid basis for claiming cigarettes alone caused every change in Warwick's voice. Natural aging is an obvious factor in a career spanning more than 6 decades, and the transcript itself does not establish smoking as the sole medical cause. What can be said responsibly is that Warwick maintained a remarkably long smoking habit while depending professionally on breath control and healthy vocal function. Cigarette exposure therefore represented an additional burden on an already aging instrument. And yet, remarkably, the music continued. The youthful brightness became darker and heavier, but Warwick retained something cigarettes and time could not easily erase: her unmistakable phrasing. Sometimes a legendary voice survives not by remaining unchanged but by learning how to work with what remains. Carmen McRae. Carmen McRae never needed enormous high notes to command a room. Her genius lived in subtler places: a delayed lyric, a perfectly positioned pause, an unexpected emphasis, or a phrase stretched just long enough to change its emotional meaning. Across more than 5 decades, she became one of jazz's great vocal interpreters. But eventually, the very act that sustained her artistry breathing became increasingly difficult. McRae was a longtime cigarette smoker, and she continued the habit even while her health deteriorated. By her later years, she suffered from severe asthma and emphysema, a chronic lung condition that progressively damages breathing capacity. For a jazz vocalist whose performances depended on exquisite control over airflow and timing, the consequences were particularly serious. Her final public engagement took place at New York's Blue Note in May 1991. Only hours after completing the engagement, McRae suffered respiratory failure. She never performed publicly again. Accounts cited in the transcript directly connect her retirement with emphysema and note that she had continued smoking despite her condition. Interestingly, McRae's voice had naturally evolved long before that final crisis. Her earlier recordings featured a somewhat higher instrument, while later decades revealed a lower, more relaxed sound. It would therefore be inaccurate to attribute every tonal change exclusively to cigarettes. What emphysema ultimately took from her was something even more fundamental: the respiratory freedom necessary to continue performing. Her final recording, Sarah Dedicated to You, appeared in 1991. After later suffering a stroke, McRae died in 1994 at age 74. Cigarettes did not erase Carmen McRae's intelligence, timing, or artistry, but the lung disease associated with her long smoking history eventually helped silence a performer whose genius depended on knowing exactly how and when to breathe. Etta James. Etta James never possessed the kind of delicate voice that depended on perfection. Even during her early career, there was grit beneath the surface, a mixture of blues, gospel, R&B, and raw emotion that made songs such as At Last and I'd Rather Go Blind unforgettable. But as the decades passed, that powerful instrument became noticeably heavier, rougher, and more weathered. Cigarettes were part of the story, although they were certainly not the only factor. James lived through years of serious addiction. She struggled with heroin beginning in the 1960s and later battled cocaine and alcohol problems. In a 1989 interview referenced in the transcript, James described a period when cigarettes, cocaine, and Remy Martin were all part of her routine. Eventually determined to regain control of her life, she said she stopped those habits together. That distinction matters. It would be inaccurate to claim that smoking alone destroyed Etta James's voice. Drugs, alcohol, aging, health problems, and decades of demanding performances all contributed to the physical burden she carried. Her increasingly gravelly sound cannot responsibly be attributed to one cause. Yet something remarkable happened. James transformed those limitations into artistic strength. Instead of attempting to recreate the smoother instrument of her youth, she embraced the rasp and emotional weight that emerged. Albums such as 7-Year Itch and Mystery Lady songs of Billie Holiday demonstrated how effectively she could use that mature sound. Etta James died in 2012, at 73, leaving behind a voice whose changing texture documented an extraordinarily difficult life. Smoking contributed to that journey, but it did not erase her artistry. If anything, James proved that even when a singer's instrument changes dramatically, greatness can survive by learning how to make every scar audible. Mariah Carey. Before Mariah Carey became famous for extraordinary high notes, intricate vocal runs, and her signature whistle register, cigarettes were already threatening the instrument that would eventually make her a superstar. Unlike many singers in this story, however, Carey recognized the problem while she was still young and made a decision that may have changed the course of her entire career. Carey has said she began smoking cigarettes at around 12 years old and continued until approximately 18. Those years were especially important because her singing voice was still developing. She later recalled suffering colds that seemed to linger because she continued smoking, and was remarkably direct about the effect, saying cigarettes had really messed up her voice. Eventually, Carey made herself a promise: if her voice recovered, she would stop smoking permanently. According to her own account, what happened after quitting was dramatic. Carey said she gained approximately 2 octaves of range, giving her developing instrument far greater freedom. The timing could hardly have been more important. Soon afterward, she began pursuing music professionally. Her self-titled debut album arrived in 1990, introducing audiences to a singer capable of enormous belts, agile melismatic runs, and extremely high whistle notes. That vocal versatility became central to her identity and helped turn her into one of the defining singers of her generation. Carey's case therefore differs sharply from stories of permanent smoking-related decline. Cigarettes did not destroy her mature professional voice. She quit before that could happen. Instead, her experience demonstrates how significantly smoking was already interfering with her voice during adolescence. The fascinating question is what might have happened had she continued. Mariah Carey heard the warning early enough to respond, and the extraordinary voice that emerged after she stopped became one of popular music's most recognizable instruments. Natalie Cole. Natalie Cole understood the danger of cigarettes in an unusually personal way. Her father, legendary singer Nat King Cole, had been a heavy smoker and died from lung cancer in 1965, at only 45. Yet witnessing that tragedy did not prevent Natalie from developing a cigarette habit of her own. By the late 1970s, Cole had established herself as a major star through recordings including This Will Be Inseparable and I've Got Love on My Mind. Her bright, agile voice had already earned Grammy recognition. But behind the success, cigarettes and increasingly serious substance abuse were creating risks for both her health and career. By 1980, Cole had attempted several times to stop smoking. That year, the American Cancer Society selected her as national chair of the Great American Smokeout. Cole explained her motivation: simply she wanted to quit for my music and my son. Given what cigarettes had already meant to her family, those words carried enormous emotional weight. Her vocal problems soon became more serious. Cole developed nodules on her vocal cords and underwent surgery to remove them in 1982. However, accuracy is essential. The transcript does not establish cigarettes as the sole cause of those nodules. This period also coincided with severe cocaine and other drug problems, creating a much broader threat to her physical health. Cole eventually entered rehabilitation and rebuilt her life. Remarkably, her voice survived strongly enough for an extraordinary comeback. In 1991, Unforgettable, With Love, her tribute to her father, became a massive success and earned multiple Grammy Awards. Natalie Cole died in 2015 at age 65, decades after her early vocal crisis. Her story is therefore not simply about a voice damaged by unhealthy habits. It is about recovery. Cigarettes represented one documented threat, but Cole confronted addiction and reclaimed enough of her instrument to create the most celebrated music of her later career. These legendary women gave the world voices that could stop a room, define an era, and turn a few minutes of music into something timeless. Yet behind the brilliance were habits, illnesses, addictions, and years of physical strain that sometimes changed those extraordinary instruments forever. From Whitney Houston and Billie Holiday to Aretha Franklin and Sarah Vaughan, each story reminds us that even the greatest voices are human and vulnerable. But here's the question: how much of their vocal decline can truly be blamed on smoking, and how much came from age, illness, or other struggles? Share your opinion and the singer whose story affected you most in the comments. Subscribe to Remembered Lives channel for more respectful stories, celebrating unforgettable musical legends.